The Wyoming wind had been screaming for 3 days, a sound like a wounded animal tearing at the walls of the cabin. Calder Brooks sat by the fire, his daughter Annie curled asleep against his chest, her small hand clutching his flannel shirt. Outside, the blizzard had erased the world. No horizon, no sky, no distinction between earth and heaven. 3 years since his wife had died. 3 years of silence and snow and the slow death of hope. He had stopped believing anything good would ever come through his door again. The knock came just before midnight, faint at first, barely audible over the howl of the storm. Calder thought he had imagined it. Then it came again, harder this time, desperate. He laid Annie gently on the pallet and crossed to the door, his hand trembling on the iron latch. The wind ripped the door from his grip when he opened it, and through the swirling white, he saw a figure collapse at his feet. A woman, her dark hair frozen, her hands blue, her body so cold it seemed to have no weight at all. He dragged her inside, kicking the door shut against the fury of the storm. She was small, light as a bird, her buckskin dress crusted with ice, her face so pale it seemed carved from the snow itself. He laid her before the fire, covered her with blankets, forced a cup of warm broth between her lips. She coughed, stirred, and for a moment, her eyes opened dark, enormous, filled with a fear that had nothing to do with the cold. Then she was gone again, slipping into unconsciousness as the fire crackled beside her. Morning came gray and muffled, the storm still raging outside the windows. Annie woke first, drawn by the strange figure on the hearth. She stood at the edge of the blankets, her thumb in her mouth, her eyes wide. "Papa, is she dead?" Calder knelt beside the woman, pressing his fingers to her neck, feeling the faint flutter of life beneath his hand. "No, sweetheart. She's alive, but she's very sick." The woman's eyes opened again, and this time they stayed open, watching him with a wariness that made his chest ache. Her name was Onatah. She spoke English haltingly, the words coming slowly, as if she had to pull them from a place she had long since closed off. She had been running for 3 days, she said, from a group of soldiers who had raided her village, from a past she did not want to speak of. She had seen the light of the cabin through the snow, had crawled the last mile on hands and knees. She asked only for shelter until the storm passed. Calder looked at her hands, the fingers still blue, the nails cracked with frost, and nodded. "You'll stay as long as you need." The days that followed were a slow dance of healing. Onatah could not walk at first, her feet too damaged by the cold, her body too weak to stand. Annie brought her food, showed her the doll her mother had made, chattered about the pony she would have when she was older. Calder watched from the doorway, his heart doing something he did not want to name. At night, when the wind howled and Annie slept, he and Onatah sat by the fire in silence, two broken people who understood, without words, that some wounds could not be spoken. On the 5th day, Onatah took the broom from the corner and began to sweep. Calder came in from the barn to find the cabin transformed, the hearth swept clean, the dishes washed, Annie's toys gathered in a basket by the bed. Onatah stood in the center of the room, leaning on the broom, her face flushed with effort. "You do not need to work," he said. She looked at him, and for the first time, there was something in her eyes that was not fear. "I need to," she said simply. "I cannot sit still while you do everything." The storm broke on the 7th day, the wind falling to a whisper, the sun breaking through the clouds to set the snow alight. Calder stood in the doorway, looking out at a world reborn, and felt something he had not felt in 3 years' dread. She would leave now. She had said she would leave when the storm passed. He turned to find her standing behind him, her hands folded, her face unreadable. "The trail to the south is clear," he said, his voice rough. "You could reach the reservation by nightfall." She did not move. "Is that what you want?" He wanted to say yes. He wanted to be the sensible man he had always been, the man who protected his daughter, who kept his distance, who had learned that love was a thing that left you bleeding. But when he looked at her, at the woman who had crawled through a blizzard to find his door, at the hands that had swept his floors and braided his daughter's hair, the words died in his throat. "I want you to stay," he said, and the words felt like falling. "If you want to," she smiled then, a small thing, fragile but real. "I want to." Spring came slowly to the Wyoming plains, the snow melting into streams, the grass greening beneath a sky that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. Onatah taught Annie to find edible roots, to track animals, to read the clouds for weather. She taught Calder to respect the land in ways he had never learned, to see the patterns in the wind, to understand that survival was not about strength, but about patience. And at night, when the cabin was quiet and Annie slept, she sat with him by the fire, her voice soft as she told him about her people, her mother, the life she had lost. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a rider on the ridge, a man in a blue coat with a hard face and a harder purpose. Calder saw him from the barn, saw the way he sat his horse, saw the rifle across his saddle. Onatah came up beside him, her hand on his arm, her body gone rigid. "He's looking for me," she whispered. "The soldiers. They have been searching since I ran." Calder looked at the rider, then at her face, at the fear she had carried since the night she collapsed on his porch. "Not anymore," he said. "You're safe here." The soldier came down the ridge, his horse picking its way through the new grass, his eyes scanning the cabin, the barn, the woman standing in the doorway. Calder met him halfway, his hands loose at his sides, his face calm. The soldier asked about an Apache woman, a runaway, a danger to the settlers in the territory. Calder looked him in the eye and said he had seen no one. The soldier stared at him for a long moment, then touched his hat and rode on. Calder stood in the field until the rider disappeared over the ridge, and then he walked back to the woman who had taught him that some things were worth lying for. That night, Onatah sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her face turned toward the flames. Calder sat across from her, watching the shadows move across her features, the lines of her face softened by the firelight. "He will come back," she said quietly. "They always come back." Calder leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Then we'll be ready." She looked up at him, and in her eyes, he saw something he had not seen before, not fear, not resignation, but something that might have been hope. "Why would you risk this?" she asked. "For me?" He did not answer immediately. He was a man who had spent 3 years learning to keep his heart locked away, a man who had told himself he would never love again. That love was a thing that cost more than he was willing to pay. But sitting here, in the firelight, with a woman who had crawled through a blizzard to find his door, he understood that some things were not a choice. "Because you matter," he said, his voice rough. "Because Annie loves you. Because He stopped, the words catching in his throat. She reached across the space between them, her hand finding his. "I know," she said softly. Summer came, and with it, a peace Calder had not thought possible. The ranch flourished, the cattle fat on the new grass, the garden yielding vegetables that Onatah knew how to preserve, the cabin filled with the sound of Annie's laughter and the quiet hum of a woman singing in a language he did not understand. They worked together, ate together, sat together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the plains. Calder had stopped counting the days since she arrived. He had stopped thinking about a future without her. She had become as necessary to him as the air he breathed. One evening, Annie asked a question that had been hovering in the air for months. "Papa, why doesn't Onatah sleep in the big bed with us?" "Mama used to." Calder felt his face heat, his heart hammering against his ribs. Onatah, who was washing dishes at the table, went very still. Annie looked from one to the other, her small face puzzled. "She can stay," Annie said firmly. "I want her to stay." Calder looked at Onatah, and she looked at him, and in the silence between them, everything that had been unspoken suddenly had weight. That night, after Annie slept, they sat on the porch under a sky so full of stars it seemed to press down on the earth. Calder took her hand, his calloused fingers finding hers, and for a long time, neither spoke. "I never thought I would feel this again," he said finally, his voice low. "After my wife died, I thought that part of me was gone, buried with her." Onatah leaned into him, her shoulder against his, her breath warm on his neck. "I thought the same," she said, "after my village was taken. After I ran, I thought I would never belong anywhere again." He turned to her then, his hand rising to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. She did not pull away. Her eyes, dark and deep, held his, and in them, he saw everything she had never said. The grief, the fear, the long years of running, and something else, something that might have been love. "I want you to stay," he said, and this time, there was no hesitation in his voice. "Not until the storm passes. Not until the soldiers stop looking. Forever." Her breath caught, and for a moment, she did not move. Then she smiled, and it was like watching the sunrise. They were married in the autumn, on a day when the cottonwoods had turned gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and apples. Annie stood between them, her small hands holding both of theirs, her face radiant with a joy that made Calder's heart ache. The ceremony was simple words spoken on the porch, a promise made in front of the only witness that mattered. Onatah wore a dress of white buckskin she had made herself, her hair braided with beads Calder had bought from a trader, and when she looked at him, he felt something he had thought was dead stir in his chest. That winter, when the first snow began to fall, Calder found Onatah standing at the window, watching the flakes drift down. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. She leaned into him, her hands covering his, and for a long time, they stood in silence, watching the world turn white. "Do you remember," she said softly, "when I came to this door?" He pressed his lips to her hair, breathing her in. "I remember." She turned in his arms, her face tilted up to his, her eyes bright. "I was dying that night. I had given up. And then I saw your light." He kissed her then, there in the window, with the snow falling and the fire burning and Annie sleeping in the next room. When he pulled back, her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. "You saved me," she whispered. He shook his head, his hands cradling her face. "We saved each other,"